If the US removes sanctions, it can definitely return to the JCPOA discussion room. If not, it will need to stay away from the negotiating table as it has been doing.
Can the 2015 Iran nuclear deal be rescued from the brink of collapse? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Delegations from Iran and 5 of the original 6 signatory countries to the 2015 nuclear agreement met in Austria to seek a pathway back to the historic pact. Missing was a representative from the United States because Tehran refuses to meet with one. In 2018, the Trump administration withdrew the US from the accord and later reimposed sanctions on the Islamic Republic. Iran subsequently ramped back up its nuclear program. Now, Iran and the United States, both under new leadership, are looking for a return to the deal, but with critical conditions attached. CGTN's Johannes Pleshberger has the details.
For 3.5 hours, Iranian diplomats negotiated with the participating world powers at Vienna's Palais Coburg, much longer than they did earlier in spring. A good sign? So far, it does not seem that a breakthrough will be reached soon, but the negotiating parties have declared themselves optimistic, with Russia even calling the start of the talks quite a success. According to Iran's top negotiator Ali Bahari Khani, all parties agreed that the focus of the talks should be the lifting of sanctions. But that's an agreement made without the United States being present, as Tehran has refused to hold direct negotiations with Washington. Messages, though, are being relayed. Meanwhile, Beijing urged the US to lift all related sanctions against Iran and third parties, including China, the Xinhua news agency reported. So far, neither Washington nor Tehran have been willing to take a first step. But there is a light on the horizon. The negotiations will continue in the upcoming days, with breaks scheduled for consultations back home in the capitals. Johannes Pleshberger, CGTN, Vienna.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a political and economic affairs commentator. Here in Washington, D.C., Barbara Slavin is the Director and Non-Resident Senior Fellow for the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, is John Kazvinian. He is the Executive Director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And from Reston, Virginia, Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Welcome to all of you. Trita Parsi, so the sides have got together for more talks. Significantly, the United States is not there, as we've just heard, but this is the first time these signatories will be talking in months. What are expectations?
Well, all sides have done a fantastic job in lowering expectations. Frankly, I think the expectation is that as long as the talks don't collapse, that in and of itself would be success. But I think we've seen some potential good news during the first day. First of all, the European facilitator and mediator here, Enrique Mora, sounded tremendously positive and optimistic after this first initial round of conversations. 2 things have happened that seem to be quite positive. One, the Iranians have agreed to pick up the talks from where they were left off 5 months ago, meaning not revisiting and going back to things that already more or less have been settled. This was a key demand by the Europeans and the United States earlier on, and the Iranians seem to now have accepted that. Secondly, in terms of the Iranian, some of the rhetoric coming from Tehran saying that they will only talk about sanctions relief, etc., turns out to have been manifested by simply making sure that the working group working on sanctions relief were scheduled ahead of the working group talking about nuclear developments. If that is all that rhetoric was aimed at achieving, well, perhaps things are not going to be as pessimistic that many people expected.
Trita, do you think it's anything of a setback that the United States is not at the table?
Well, the United States wants to be at the table. The United States wants to talk directly to the Iranians. It's the Iranians have decided that until the U.S. is back into the deal, they will not engage directly with it. I think the Iranians are fearing that engaging the U.S. without the U.S. first coming back into the deal will enable the U.S. to switch the tables on them and then potentially get an upper hand in some form of a blame game. But I think in retrospect, it's quite clear it was a mistake by the Iranians not to engage directly with the United States. Things could have moved forward much faster and better. And also, both sides are probably not going to reveal their bottom lines to the Europeans. They're only going to reveal them to each other in direct negotiations.
John Ghazvinian, both sides may not want to reveal their positions, but they did stake out their opening positions before these talks started. And it seems that both sides have very different goals. On the United States side, the United States is talking about restricting Iran's nuclear program, about tightening provisions that were in the original agreement. But the Iranians want to talk primarily right now about the lifting of sanctions. Given that these positions seem so far apart, is there a halfway point, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that remains to be seen, but I think you're right that both sides are taking, and these are the positions that they're coming to the table with, the specific demands as you list them, but I think there's a deeper internal political battle that both sides are taking back to their own domestic political constituencies. They may come, with these, with the demands as you've outlined them. But really, I think ultimately both would like to be able to say to their domestic political constituencies that they achieved a better deal than the one that was there before. From the perspective of the new Iranian administration, of course, it's always been a position of hardline administrations that they want to be able to show that they're more reformist or pragmatic rivals give the house away too quickly to the Americans, and that talking tough can actually pay dividends. And I think they would actually love to see a deal, one that they can claim was sort of a better deal, a harder deal, a stronger deal. And the Biden administration has always been talking about that. They will also face pretty significant domestic oppositions if they don't come back with something that at least appears to strengthen the previous nuclear deal. So that would make meeting in the middle very, very difficult. But there's also, at the same time, this built-in political incentive that both sides have. So I think this is why we're seeing this strange seesawing between pessimism and optimism over the last few days. I think there are good reasons for both pessimism and optimism.
Barbara, do you think the Biden administration has a little bit of a credibility problem to overcome here? Because how does one explain the fact that Joe Biden was a member of the administration that actually signed the original JCPOA? In fact, he was the number 2 in that administration. Yet, since coming to office, he's retained most of the sanctions imposed by President Trump, and he wants a tightened, amended JCPOA with extended timelines.
No, I don't think so. Look, the hope for a longer and stronger deal was something that was expressed early on in the Biden administration, but I'm sure that simply getting back to the old agreement would be seen as a huge victory after all the time that has gone by. You can criticize the Biden administration perhaps for not taking some steps early on, some goodwill steps, but there is a total lack of trust between the United States and Iran. I mean, we've seen very few breakthroughs over the last 40 years. The JCPOA was a real exception to the rule. And what the U.S. is looking for is a schedule of steps that Iran would take to come back into compliance with the agreement. Iran has enormously accelerated its nuclear program over the past few months. And the U.S. is not going to announce sanctions relief until it's sure that Iran will also take steps to go back into compliance.
Barbara, that lack of trust that you talk about, isn't the United States responsible for that by unilaterally withdrawing from the deal? It effectively violated the deal.
Yes, it is, but Iran has done a number of things that have also undermined trust. For example, it's still holding on to a gentleman named Siamak Namazi, who was seized around the time that the JCPOA was coming into existence, has been held longer than any other dual national for no good reason. So steps like that certainly undermine confidence and trust as well.
Aina Tangen, China is one of the signatories to this agreement, the JCPOA. Chinese diplomats are, of course, at the table. They are at the talks. What does China bring to the process?
Well, China is trying to bring stability. The interest here is keep it nuclear proliferation at a minimum. They would also like to see more trade and openness in that area. They do not need more conflict. Iran is a major supplier of oil to China and will probably continue to be. So they're going to probably side a little bit more with Iran. I think the analysis that the U.S. started it and this idea that they want to improve their position through bad action. The larger issue here for Iran is, what does it all mean? Joe Biden says one thing or another, promises this, that, who knows? The Republican administration might be in a few years, or there could be a Congress that is dominated by Republicans, and they could backtrack on that. So reliability and trust is a huge factor on both sides. And, Iran has a very reasonable reason to believe that the U.S. could at any time in the future do exactly what they did before. So it's not, as Barbara said, just a trust deficit on the on the U.S. side. This is really about long-term trust. Violating that agreement was a major faux pas for the United States, and it brings into question, along with Afghanistan and AUKUS and all of these things, exactly what the U.S. is doing and whether they can hold a steady course over a period of administrations.
Trita Parsi, that is a problem, isn't it? Because the Iranians want to have some kind of agreement that will last. They don't want to see a new administration come into office in Washington and tear up the agreement like Donald Trump did. I mean, that's a demand that they're making. Is that going to be fulfilled in any way? Can it be fulfilled?
It is, in my view, quite an understandable demand, because at the end of the day, it is extremely destabilizing to the Iranian economy if the United States can willy-nilly go in and out of the deal. And let's be very frank, if there is a Republican administration in 2024, it is extremely unlikely that it will not walk out of the JCPOA. I don't think binding guarantees necessarily are in the cards, but what can, and in my view should be done, is to think through some mechanisms that can be put into place to ensure not that it's binding, but that it is costlier than it is right now for any state to exit the agreement. I think we have to keep in mind that the snapback provision in the UN Security Council was invented for this very issue of the JCPOA, to make sure that if the Iranians cheated, there would be a swift reimposition of sanctions without any opportunity for any countries to slow down that process. It would be good to have something similar to that would also affect other countries, including the United States, if it walked out. Because the problem that exists right now is that it is almost cost-free for the United States to leave the agreement. As long as that is the case, it's going to be very difficult to make the JCPOA stable and enduring.
One other point, Trita, and that is the positions that the two sides have going into these negotiations. There are those in the United States who will tell you that the aim of these talks is to prevent Iran ultimately obtaining a nuclear weapon. Iran has always maintained that it is not. Its nuclear program is not about obtaining a nuclear weapon. It is for civilian uses. Since then, of course, as we've just been talking, the United States has withdrawn from the agreement. Iran has also felt, with the United States withdrawal, that it is not bound by the terms of the agreement any longer. This is what the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Mariano, had to say. Let's listen to him.
Iran is continuing with a very, I would say, strong and ambitious nuclear program, which is enriching uranium at levels very close to weapon grade, at 60%. Weapon grade is 90%.
So, Trita, Iran has resumed enriching uranium. What is the Iranian strategy? Is Iran trying to establish some facts on the ground from which it could then negotiate?
I think so, and frankly, that's what we should be hoping. It is much better that within this unfortunate and very negative development of the Iranians increasing enrichment to 60%, it's much better if they're doing so because they think it gives them leverage and they want to negotiate that away. Consider what the alternative would be, which is that they're actually aiming to slowly but surely get to 90% and then build a weapon. That would obviously be much, much worse. That is why it is so important that these talks continue, despite the pessimism, despite the low expectations. As long as the talks continue, and as long as there's some sign of willingness to have some form of a give and take, then we still have hope to make sure that not only is the JCPOA revived, but also we can avoid a nuclear Iran, and we can also avoid a major war in the region.
John Ghazvinian, the signatories to the JCPOA will now be negotiating with a very different Iranian government. President Rouhani is no longer in office. President Ibrahim Raisi is described, the new president is described as being an ultra-conservative. He's a hardliner, which I guess means that he's going to be less inclined to make compromises very easily. How does that change the negotiating dynamics?
Yeah, I think that's actually related very much to your previous question about what exactly Iran's strategy is. And I think it's an important distinction at the risk of oversimplification, because Iranian politics is extremely complex and there are many different factions and political tendencies. But if we can very broadly look at the last 40 years of the Islamic Republic's approach to the nuclear issue, there have been two different strains of thinking. Roughly speaking, a more principled one and a more pragmatic one that, roughly speaking, map onto hardline versus kind of moderate, pragmatic, or reformist administrations. Typically speaking, when a sort of pragmatic or reformist administration is in place, they tend to, and both of them have the same red lines and the same basic negotiating positions on the nuclear issue, but for different reasons, and they're looking for different things. Pragmatists, reformists typically are more interested in making sure Iran doesn't find itself in a situation where its technological, its political, its scientific progress is being restrained. They really emphasize things that the sort of nuts and bolts of radioisotopes for cancer treatment, for energy production, things like that, and they try to come up with pragmatic solutions that the West can also be happy with. When the principalists are in power, as they are now, they're generally more interested in the principle, making the point that Iran should not be held to a different standard than the rest of the world. These may seem like subtle differences, but actually it really informs the approach that they take to these kinds of negotiations. And so I think what we'll be seeing from this new administration is less of a concern over percentage enrichment and what in centrifuges and things like that, and more of an attempt to get the U.S. and the P5+1 to recognize Iran's right to enrich uranium, to demonstrate that Iran is not being treated with disrespect over this nuclear issue. So I think as long as American and P5+1 negotiators can bear that in mind, they will, I think, be able to speak the language of the people on the other side of the table from them a little bit better.
Barbara, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think the both sides will agree to at least that Iran's needs have to be respected, that Iran is engaged in a civilian process here, it doesn't want to manufacture bombs?
Well, the JCPOA acknowledged that Iran could enrich uranium under certain restrictions, with limits on the purity of the uranium, limits on the stockpiles of uranium that went out for 15 years. So there really isn't any leeway there. I mean, we're not talking at this point about negotiating an entirely new agreement. Remember that the first one took 12 years, essentially, to get to. So if Iran and the United States and the other countries are able to reach an agreement, it will mean that Iran has to go back to having no more than 300 kilograms of uranium enriched to less than 5%. It will have to get rid of its stockpiles of higher and higher enriched uranium. There's a report, not confirmed, out that Iran even wants to enrich to 90%. All of that will have to go. Is Iran prepared to do that for sanctions relief that will give it an immediate injection in terms of maybe $100 billion in frozen oil revenues that it would get access to, the ability to sell oil much more freely, but hanging over, as my co-panelists have said, the possibility that a future U.S. administration might pull out of the JCPOA again. I mean, this is a decision that the Iranian regime writ large has to make. Is it worth it to get a few years of sanctions relief when the future is unknown and unknowable?
Just on that question of sanctions relief, Barbara, when the original agreement was signed in 2015, the United States lifted sanctions. It also released a vast sum of money to the Iranians. Actually, that was Iranian money from oil sales. But the Iranians at that time say that they didn't accrue many benefits from the lifting of sanctions because there were other restrictions in place at that time as well. There were mainly financial restrictions. So does Iran have a point right now when it says, look, you've got to lift the sanctions first?
No, I'm sorry. There may be justice to it in terms of the fact that the U.S. quit first, was in violation first, but that's simply unrealistic. It's not going to happen that way. It has to be mutual, or it's not going to happen. And in terms of the fact that Iran didn't get the benefits, that's partly due to the election of Donald Trump in the fall of 2016, which made a number of foreign companies in particular lose their heart and quit Iran, quit projects that they'd agreed to. But it's also a function of problems within the Iranian economy: corruption, mismanagement, lack of transparency. Iran is yet to sign on to legislation that would prohibit money laundering and that would act against terrorism. These are things that obviously give major companies pause. And in Western democracies, capitalist democracies, you can't order your companies to do business with a country like Iran if there isn't confidence in the quality of those transactions.
Trita Parsi, when we look at the sanctions that were imposed in Iran, I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Does Iran have a point when it says that it didn't really get much in the way of benefits when the initial sanctions were lifted? So, you know, the West has to show some good faith now by lifting sanctions.
Well, I think, first of all, there were massive problems with the sanctions relief already back then, and it's not necessarily targeting Iran. It's the reality that the United States is quite adept at imposing sanctions, but very inexperienced when it comes to lifting sanctions. Frankly, the United States almost never lifts sanctions. Just take the example of Iraq. It took till 2010 until the last sanction on Iraq were lifted, despite the regime change that the United States did in that country. So there's been definitely problems. Whether then that justifies the Iranian position that the United States needs to go first or not, I think is a bit of a different problem. I do think that the Iranians, as Barbara said, have to make some tough choices. However, I don't think it is as simple as to say, look, this is just a situation, accept it or leave it. There are mitigating factors and there are mitigating mechanisms that can, and in my view, should be put into place in order to create greater degree of stability in this agreement. If the JCPOA survived one American exit, that in and of itself is a miracle. I have great doubts that it will be able to survive a second American exit. So if we do think that this is a good agreement that is serving the interests of the United States, first and foremost, from an American perspective, but also serving stability, non-proliferation, etc., I don't understand why it should be so difficult to engage on mechanisms to make it more durable and make it more stable. And one way of doing so, of course, is to make sure that there's some symmetry when it comes to the cost that a country will incur on itself if it chooses to exit the agreement and betray the agreement.
Aina Tangen, we're talking about United States sanctions against Iran, but of course there is China. China has signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran. It calls for something like $400 billion in investment in Iran in return for guaranteed discounted oil supplies over the next 25 years. Are any of these sanctions affected by that agreement, or does it, in fact, give Iran some kind of leverage?
Well, not really leverage. China is a sovereign nation, and they are sticking by the JCPOA agreement, at least the spirit of it. But you know, whatever China and Iran do, Iran wants to normalize its relations with the rest of the world. They do have issues. Barbara is correct in that. But, you know, Barbara is, in essence, just said, you know, the U.S. is an intransigent nation. You cannot trust what it does from administration to administration. I just don't know how well that plays out in the rest of the world. I mean, this is not just Iran we're talking about, but everywhere else. But one thing we don't seem to have talked about is the wild card in the room, and that is Israel. There have been attacks on the facilities themselves, the nuclear facilities. One of the leading scientists, or the leading scientist, was brutally executed in an ambush attack. It's the worst kept secret in the world that Israel has, in fact, many nuclear weapons, estimated between 50 and 100. But it's not actually talked about. And this is one of the flies in the ointment. You can talk about the political cost to Joe Biden of actually coming to the table with something, but until Israel is somehow involved, I don't know how this, in fact, can be solved, because whatever the JCPOA and the U.S. does, Israel has taken a very independent track in terms of pushing its agenda.
That's right. Israel, in fact, has said that it is not part of the JCPOA and therefore not bound by the terms of the JCPOA.
Absolutely. And this is, as I said, I don't know how you can have an outside actor that is nuclear armed, that is actively engaging in this, not doing. I mean, obviously the inference is that the U.S., with giving Israel billions of dollars each year, could in fact put pressure on Israel to come to the table and be somewhat reasonable about this. But that is not going to happen, both politically and also, just from the stream of logic that's coming. Barbara was, she expresses the talk points that Washington feels they have, and saying, it's now or never, take what you can get. But this is the kind of talk of a hegemon, just like, right. You have to lump it, and this is not something that people like.
All right, let me give Barbara a chance to respond to that. Barbara, go ahead.
No, look, I'm talking about political realities. I mean, the fact that the United States has the power it has over the international financial system because of the role of the dollar as a reserve currency, the major reserve currency. That's what gives the United States muscle. That's what enables the United States to impose sanctions on so many countries. And you can argue with that and say it's unjust, but it is a fact of life, and Iran understands that, and China understands that.
Okay, John, very quickly, I've got about a minute left. Least we forget, there are other countries who have signed this JCPOA. There's Russia, there's Germany, there's France, there's the United Kingdom as well. What do they bring to these negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, this is the irony, right? Is that, really, in reality, we're now looking at a P4+1. The United States is no longer actually a signatory to the agreement. And yet the U.S. is the country that everybody's, kind of looking at. And that really speaks to Barbara's point, actually, which is that, very little of this is going to stick without the United States. And it actually speaks to the previous point about Israel, which is, Israel does have a unique, shall we say, ability to sort of shape a lot of the political narrative in the United States. And yet also is not a member of the P5+1. In a way, Israel has the best of both worlds. It's, the P5+1 has always functioned on the basis of consensus, which means the lowest common denominator negotiating point, or the toughest negotiating position, is the one that they'll end up taking. And that usually ends up being that of the United States, which often happens to line up with that of Israel. So, and that puts Israel in a very strong position of being able to both derail the talks or disrupt them when they want, but also toughen them when they want. So.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.